Welcome, dear wanderers. I'm Mooncat, and tonight we journey with Zaelith Vonnari through the wintry wonders of the Faelyn Valley. So wrap yourself in a warm blanket, let the story unfold, and if you enjoy these quiet adventures, be sure to like and subscribe. Let's begin. The air was cold and sharp as a blade's edge when Zaelith Vonnari stepped into the Faelyn Valley. Snow crunched softly beneath her boots, muffled by the thick carpet of frost that coated the earth like a quilt spun from clouds. Above her, the forest stretched tall and unyielding, its ancient trees adorned with a filigree of ice that glimmered in the pale winter light. It was as if the entire wood had been dipped in silver and left to harden in the stillness of time. Zaelith paused to take it all in. Her violet eyes swept over the frost-laden branches, their crystalline forms refracting the light into tiny rainbows that danced across her midnight blue skin. A faint smile played at her lips, one that hinted at mischief and wonder in equal measure. She reached out a gloved hand, letting her fingers brush the delicate fringe of icicles that hung like chandeliers from a low bough. They chimed faintly, the sound like a distant bell carried on the wind. The forest smelled clean, like pine needles and the faint tang of frozen air. It was quiet but not silent. The hush of the valley carried with it the sense of breath held in reverence. Somewhere far off, a brook murmured beneath a crust of ice, its trickling voice weaving with the occasional rustle of snow-laden branches. Enchanted, no doubt, Zaelith murmured to herself, her voice soft, her words visible in the air as fleeting puffs of breath. She tightened her cloak around her, its silver embroidery glinting faintly against the deep indigo fabric, and resumed her trek. Her silver hair spilled over her shoulders, catching the wintry light like strands of moonlight. Her boots left an elegant trail through the snow, a wandering path that marked her progress through the crystalline labyrinth. Each step seemed to echo, not loudly, but with a presence that acknowledged the forest itself as a living, breathing entity. As she walked, her mind drifted to a memory, a forest much like this one, though harsher, less forgiving. She had been younger then, with a sharper edge to her cunning and less patience for subtlety. The labyrinth of ice caves had been treacherous, filled with illusions that sought to lead her astray, but the prize she had sought, the amulet of Kharisethra-a, had gleamed in her thoughts like a beacon. The memory brought a grin to her lips as she thought of the ice wraith that had tried to bar her path. It had been clever, she recalled, spinning riddles of frost and shadow in an attempt to confuse her. Clever, but not clever enough. With a mixture of wit and sword play, Zaelith had carved her way through the wraith's tricks and emerged victorious, her prize gleaming in her grasp. That was a good one, she mused aloud, her voice a soft purr in the wintry quiet. The wraith was almost charming, in its own spectral way. Her reverie was interrupted by the faintest shimmer of movement overhead. Zaelith glanced up, her keen eyes catching a flash of silver, and white as a snow owl swept silently between the branches. It glided like a phantom, its feathers ghostly against the denser lattice of frost-covered trees. The sight stirred something deep within her. An ache, perhaps, or the fleeting whisper of a forgotten song. She let the feeling settle in her chest, neither pushing it away nor pulling it closer. There was a peace in letting the moment simply exist. Zaelith continued deeper into the valley, the forest growing denser around her. The interplay of light and shadow became more intricate, the icy branches weaving an ever-changing tapestry above her head. She felt as though she were walking through a dream, a place both solid and ephemeral. She traced her gloved fingers along the ridged bark of a tree as she passed, marveling at how the frost had etched delicate patterns into its surface, tiny filigrees that resembled constellation. If she squinted, she could almost believe the frost had formed runes, whispering secrets in a language older than her own. "What stories do you hold, I wonder?" Zaelith asked the tree, her tone light but reverent. The bark offered no reply, save for the faint creak of its icy burden shifting in the wind. By the time the light began to soften, turning the snow a pale rose, Zaelith found herself at a clearing. Here the trees pulled back as if to offer her a moment of respite. In the center of the space, a pool lay frozen, its surface a perfect mirror reflecting the blushing sky above. Zaelith knelt by its edge, brushing away the light dusting of snow with the back of her hand. She stared at her own reflection, the sharp lines of her face softened by the diffused light, her silver hair pooling around her like liquid starlight. For a moment she felt something close to stillness. "Just another step," she said softly, her voice nearly lost in the gentle sigh of the wind. "Another piece of the journey." As the sun began to set, Zaelith rose, drawing her cloak tightly around her. The clearing behind her faded into the silver blue of twilight, but her steps carried her forward toward the promise of warmth and friendship that lay at the journey's end. The path ahead of Zaelith wound downward, descending into a hollow cradled in the arms of the Faelyn Valley. Here the air felt softer, as if the snow itself carried an enchantment of quiet gentleness. She stepped lightly, the crunch of her boots muffled by the thickness of the frost. Around her, the trees began to thin, their crystalline branches giving way to open space. She knew she had found something rare even before the hollow fully revealed itself. The glimmering snow-lilies were the first to catch her eye. They dotted the hollow like stars scattered across a velvet sky, their soft, silvery glow casting an otherworldly light on the ground. Each petal was etched with veins of luminescence, pulsing faintly as though alive. The lilies seemed to hum with a magic that was ancient and serene, their presence filling the air with a sense of sacred tranquility. Zaelith knelt beside one of the blossoms, her violet eyes studying it with quiet wonder. She reached out but hesitated, letting her gloved hand hover just above the petals. There was a reverence to the moment, a silent acknowledgement that some things were best admired rather than touched. "They bloom despite the frost," she murmured, a note of awe in her voice, delicate yet unyielding. "Remarkable." The faint hum of the lilies grew louder, almost imperceptibly, as if responding to her presence. The sound was not a song, nor was it silence. It was the vibration of something eternal, something that did not demand to be understood. Zaelith settled onto the snow-dappled ground, letting her gaze wander over the hollow. The lilies were not alone. Other forms of life had made their home here, drawn to the warmth of the flower's glow. A snow hare with fur so white it seemed to melt into the frost nibbled delicately at a tuft of frozen moss. Tiny frost-winged moths flitted from lily to lily, their translucent wings catching the light in flashes of iridescent blue and green. She tilted her head, a soft smile playing on her lips. a sanctuary, she said softly. Even in the coldest places, life finds a way to thrive. The sight stirred a memory. Another winter forest years ago, though far less kind than the Faelyn Valley. She had been on a quest to find a bloom as rare and beautiful as the snow-lilies, the frosted iris of Elvar. Her client had claimed it was the key to a healing potion that could cure even the most grievous wounds. It had taken days of navigating through endless snowdrifts, dodging the cunning traps of ice, goblins, and the ceaseless howl of a winter storm. The final test had been the most challenging. A snow fairy, her voice as cold and sharp as icicles, had appeared to guard the flower. The fairy had demanded payment. Not in gold, but in a tale worth telling. Zaelith had stood beneath the brittle branches of a frozen willow, the frosted iris just out of reach, and spun a story from her own adventures. It had been a tale of wit and daring, of riddles solved and treasures won. The snow fairy had listened, her icy features softening, and when Zaelith finished, the fairy had laughed. A sound as light as snowfall, and granted her the bloom. Zaelith chuckled at the memory. Charming creatures, fairies, she said aloud, her voice blending with the hollow soft hum, as long as you know how to play their games. The thought warmed her as she rose from her place beside the snow lilies. She took one last, lingering look at the hollow. The glimmering flowers swayed gently, their light undiminished by the growing dusk. She imagined they would remain as they were for years to come, untouched by time or hardship, a quiet defiance against the cold. Her steps were slow as she made her way back to the path, reluctant to leave the sanctuary behind. The hollow seemed to bid her farewell, in its own way, the hum of the lilies fading into a whisper as she moved further from their glow. The snow hare watched her go, its dark eyes reflecting the faint light like polished onyx. As she climbed out of the hollow, the trees began to close in again, their frost-covered branches forming a dense canopy overhead. The light dimmed, shifting into shades of blue and grey as night began to settle over the valley. Zaelith pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, though the cold no longer seemed to bite as sharply. The memory of the snow lilies lingered in her thoughts, their glow a quiet beacon against the encroaching darkness. For a moment, she stopped and glanced back. The hollow was no longer visible, hidden now by the curve of the path and the forest beyond. But she knew it was still there, a place of quiet magic waiting patiently for the next traveller to find it. Perhaps I'll visit again someday, Zaelith said softly, her voice carrying into the stillness. Then, with a final glance at the darkening sky, she turned and continued her journey, her footsteps light against the snow. Ahead, the forest beckoned, its mysteries unfolding with each step. Zaelith pressed onward, her breath of faint mist in the growing dusk. The Faelyn Valley, ever changing, had drawn her into a new realm of quiet mystery. Here the trees grew thick and close together, their trunks dark and ancient, their frost-laden branches entwined like clasped hands. The air felt heavier, steeped in an almost sacred stillness, and Zaelith slowed her steps instinctively, her boots barely crunching the snow beneath her. The thicket seemed to absorb all sound, even the faint whispers of the winter wind, which had accompanied her throughout the day, were stilled here. Zaelith paused, letting the stillness settle around her like a cloak. Her sharp ears caught no rustle of branches, no distant calls of birds, no murmur of hidden streams. It was a silence so deep it felt alive, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. She reached out to touch the nearest tree, its bark rough beneath the frost that coated it. The tree stood sturdy and tall, its branches spread wide above her, forming a lattice that seemed to trap the fading light of day. The snow here was untouched, a pristine blanket that stretched out beneath her feet, undisturbed by the tracks of animals or the passage of time. "This place feels expectant," Zaelith whispered, though her words seemed swallowed by the silence before they could take shape. Her violet eyes scanned the dense maze of trunks and shadows, her movements careful but unhurried. It wasn't fear that slowed her, but reverence. There was a sacred quality to the thicket, a weight in the air that reminded her of ancient temples and whispered prayers. She caught movement in her periphery, a fleeting flicker of silver fur darting between the trees. A moment later, a second figure followed, smaller and darker. Zaelith stopped, waiting, and was rewarded with the sight of two silver foxes weaving through the shadows. Their coats glistened as though dusted with starlight, their eyes bright and curious. They paused to regard her, their bodies motionless, except for the faint flick of their tails. Zaelith inclined her head in greeting. "Be at ease, little guardians," she murmured, her tone soft. "I mean no harm to your sanctuary." The foxes lingered for a moment longer before slipping silently into the underbrush, vanishing as if they had never been. Zaelith watched the spot where they had disappeared, a faint smile curling her lips. Her thoughts drifted to another forest, another silence, one far less serene. Years ago she had ventured into a winter wood plagued by spectral wolves, their howls echoing like mournful laments through the trees. Those woods had been steeped in malevolence, the air thick with the chill of an unnatural winter. Zaelith had been younger then, less tempered by experience but no less resourceful. The memory of that chase, the wolves' glowing eyes tracking her every step, still stirred a thrill in her chest. But it was her sword that had saved her that time, its silver edge flashing like moonlight as she danced through the snow, outmaneuvering the wolves with a mixture of skill and cunning. She could still remember the bite of the cold on her cheeks, the exhilaration of the chase, and the hard-won satisfaction of escaping unscathed. "This is no place for wolves," Zaelith said quietly, returning to the present. The thicket's silence held no malice, no lurking threat. It was a stillness born of peace, not danger. As she moved deeper into the forest, the light continued to fade, and the thicket seemed to tighten around her. The trees grew closer together, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out the stars. Yet even in the growing darkness, Zaelith felt no fear. The silence was companionable, wrapping around her like an old friend. She paused again when she noticed another movement, this time above her. High in the branches of a gnarled tree, a frost-winged sparrow perched on a bare limb. Its tiny form was almost invisible against the backdrop of snow and shadow, but its wings shimmered faintly, catching what little light remained. Zaelith stood still, watching as the bird flitted from branch to branch, its movements quick and graceful. The sparrow paused, tilting its head to regard her. Its tiny black eyes glittered, and Zaelith felt a curious connection in that moment, as if the bird were a silent emissary of the forest itself. She nodded again, a wordless acknowledgement of the fragile beauty of the moment. The sparrow's wings fluttered once more, and then it vanished into the shadows, leaving the thicket as silent as before. Zaelith resumed her journey, her steps careful and deliberate. The snow here seemed softer, almost reluctant to give way beneath her boot. Her silver hair trailed behind her like a ghost, catching faint glimmers of light that filtered through the tangled branches. Eventually the thicket began to loosen its hold. The trees grew further apart, the canopy above thinning to reveal glimpses of a night sky speckled with stars. The silence remained, but it was lighter now, less dense, as if the forest had exhaled its held breath. Zaelith stopped at the edge of the thicket, turning to glance back at the maze of shadows and froth. The silver foxes were nowhere to be seen, nor the sparrow, but their presence lingered in her thoughts. Silent, but not empty, Zaelith said softly, her words drifting into the night air. She gave a faint smile, then turned and stepped beyond the thicket, her journey continuing through the serene expanse of the Faelyn Valley. Ahead, the promise of new wonders awaited, as the valley unfolded its mysteries one step at a time. The trees opened gradually, giving way to a narrow clearing where the land dipped toward a stream. The water, encased in ice, glimmered faintly in the pale light of the moon, now rising above the Faelyn Valley. Zaelith Vonnari paused at the edge of the clearing, drawing her cloak closer against the crisp night air. Before her lay a bridge, a delicate span of ice that arched gracefully over the frozen stream. It shimmered like crystal, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift subtly as she gazed at them. The frost on the bridge sparkled as if kissed by starlight, and Zaelith's violet eyes lingered on its artistry. The ice was impossibly clear, as though a winter spirit had crafted it from a single, flawless shard. Runes, barely discernible, were carved along the bridge's edge, their soft glow reminiscent of moonlit snow. She approached with care, her boots crunching on the snow-packed ground. At the bridge's base, the snow gave way to ice so smooth it reflected her face, like a silvered mirror. Zaelith knelt and traced her gloved fingers over one of the glowing runes, its edges sharp, but cold and unyielding. She didn't recognize the symbols, though their craftsmanship suggested they belonged to no common magic. The Guardian's work, Zaelith murmured to herself, her tone thoughtful. Old magic, patient magic. The stream beneath the bridge was not entirely frozen. A dark vein of water ran through its center, its surface rippling faintly. The faint sound of flowing water was soothing, almost melodic, as if the stream itself sang a quiet, endless song. Zaelith straightened and stepped carefully onto the bridge. Her boots found solid purchase, though the surface was unnervingly clear, giving her the sensation of walking on air. The stars above and the glimmer of the stream below blurred together, as if she were moving through the fabric of the night itself. Midway across, Zaelith paused and looked down. Her reflection in the dark water was distorted, shifting like a shadow on a winter's breath. For a fleeting moment, the face staring back at her was not entirely her own. The silver hair was there, the violet eyes. Yet there was something different, something other. She tilted her head, and the reflection mimicked her, but the impression of another presence lingered, subtle and intangible. She smiled faintly. "You have your secrets," she whispered to the water, her voice barely more than a breath. "Keep them then. I've mine as well." The air here felt alive, charged with the kind of magic that was ancient but not menacing. It was a force that watched but did not interfere, a silent observer, as timeless as the bridge itself. Zaelith took another step and noticed how the frost beneath her boots resonated faintly, the vibration humming up through her legs like the strings of an unseen harp. The sensation was fleeting, but not unpleasant, a subtle reminder of the enchantment woven into the bridge. Her thoughts drifted to another bridge, one from a past winter that had been far less serene. That bridge had spanned a frozen river during a storm that howled like 1,000 wolves. The frost giant who had guarded it had been as unyielding as the ice beneath her feet, demanding tribute before allowing her passage. Zaelith had stood before the giant, her blade sheathed, her words carefully chosen. "You want a tale," she had said, her voice steady despite the storm's fury. "Something to carry with you through the endless winters." The giant had considered her for a long moment, his icy eyes narrowing as the wind roared around them. Then he had nodded, and Zaelith had spoken of her adventures, of lost treasures and forgotten ruin, of riddles and narrow escape. Her words had flowed like the river beneath them, weaving a story that had softened the giant's frozen heart. In the end, he had laughed, a sound like the grinding of glaciers, and allowed her to cross. "That was a fine story," Zaelith said aloud now, her voice carrying faintly in the stillness of the Faelyn Valley. "Perhaps this bridge too has its tales." She took the final steps to the far side and turned, looking back at the span of ice. It seemed almost to float in the moonlight, untouched by time or decay. The runes glowed softly, their light ebbing and flowing like the pulse of a living thing. Zaelith inclined her head in silent gratitude. "Thank you for the passage," she said, her words as much for herself as for whatever spirit might linger there. The bridge offered no reply, but the faint hum of its magic seemed to deepen, as if acknowledging her presence. Beyond the bridge, the forest awaited. The trees here were lighter in tone, their frost-covered branches catching the moonlight and scattering it like shards of silver. The snow seemed softer, almost luminous, and Zaelith's steps became lighter as she moved forward. Behind her, the frosted bridge faded into the darkness, its glow dimming as the thicket of trees embraced her once more. Yet its memory lingered, a quiet, crystalline moment etched into the tapestry of her journey. Zaelith walked on, the sound of the stream's quiet song fading into the stillness of the forest. The air grew colder, but her thoughts were warm, her mind alight with the wonder of the valley and the promise of more mysteries to come. Ahead, the path wound onward, its secrets waiting to be revealed. The forest shifted again as Zaelith stepped further into the valley, the dense thicket of gnarled trees giving way to a grove of towering pines. Their trunks stretched high into the starlit sky, their needle-covered branches creating a canopy that swayed gently in the breeze. A low, melodic sound filled the air, the whispering of the pines. It was not a sound Zaelith had heard before, yet it felt familiar. as if the forest were breathing softly around her. She paused at the edge of the grove, tilting her head to listen. The whispering was layered and intricate, as if 1,000 soft voices were speaking at once, though no single word could be made out. The sound was soothing, lulling her into a quiet reverie. Zaelith took a slow breath, letting the peace of the moment settle over her like a warm cloak. The pines were ancient, their presence commanding yet kind, and she felt as though she had entered a sanctuary where the concerns of the outside world could not intrude. The path through the grove was narrow, but well trodden, blanketed with a fine layer of pine needles that softened her footsteps. The air smelled of resin and cold earth, a rich and grounding scent that seemed to anchor her to the present. Snow clung lightly to the needles above her, the occasional flurry drifting down like tiny stars shaken loose from the heavens. Zaelith ran her fingers along the rough bark of a nearby tree as she passed, marveling at the faint frost patterns that curled over its surface. The tree seemed to hum faintly beneath her touch, resonating with the whispers in the air. It was a quiet magic, one that pulsed through the grove like the heartbeat of the earth itself. "Do you speak to each other?" she wondered aloud, her voice soft and curious. "Or is this for yourselves, a song only the pines can hear?" The grove, of course, did not answer, but the whispering seemed to deepen, a faint sighing that carried a hint of warmth despite the frost. Zaelith smiled, her silver hair catching the dim light as she moved deeper into the grove. She had always been drawn to places like this, ancient and alive, steeped in magic that was neither overt nor demanding. The grove reminded her of a ruin she had once stumbled upon during another journey, buried beneath a blanket of snow. That place, too, had whispered to her, its crumbling stones murmuring secrets from a time long past. It had been there, beneath the shattered arches of a forgotten temple, that she had solved a riddle etched in runes older than her own tongue. The memory came easily as she walked, her mind painting the scene with the same clarity as the grove around her. She had traced her fingers over the frost-covered runes, the patterns forming a puzzle that only patience and intuition could untangle. The prize had been an enchanted blade, its edge sharp enough to cut through shadow. She still carried it, its hilt snug against her side, a constant companion on her journeys. "Perhaps you've been here before," Zaelith mused, patting the hilt of the blade as if it could respond. "It feels like the kind of place you'd know." A sudden rustling drew her attention, and she stopped, her violet eyes scanning the grove. A breeze stirred the branches, sending another flurry of snow drifting down. Zaelith stayed still, listening, and soon caught sight of movement. A small, silver-furred creature darting through the underbrush. It was a pine marten, its sleek body agile as it wove through the fallen needle. The creature paused to glance at her, its dark eyes bright with curiosity, before slipping into the shadows once more. Zaelith smiled to herself. The forest was alive with quiet life, its creatures as much a part of the magic as the trees themselves. She continued on, her steps light, her senses attuned to the faint whispers that surrounded her. At the heart of the grove, she found a clearing. Here the pines formed a perfect circle, their branches arching overhead like the ribs of a great cathedral. In the centre stood a single, enormous pine, its trunk gnarled with age. Its bark was covered in faint, glowing patterns. Runes similar to those she had seen on the frosted bridge. The runes pulsed gently, their light waxing and waning like a quiet breath. Zaelith approached the ancient tree, her movement. Reverent, she placed a hand against its trunk, feeling the steady hum of its magic beneath her fingers. The whispers seemed louder here, though still soft, their voices blending into a single harmonious note. It was a song of time and patience, of growth and resilience. "You've seen many winters," Zaelith said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "and likely more to come." She stayed for a while in the clearing, letting the peace of the grove wash over her. The whispers continued, weaving around her like a protective spell. Time seemed to stretch, each moment expanding into eternity. There was no need to hurry here, no need to think of what lay ahead. Eventually, Zaelith rose, her silver cloak flowing around her. As she stepped away from the ancient tree, she inclined her head in thanks, a small gesture of respect, before turning to leave the grove. The pines whispered on as she walked away, their voices following her like a fading echo. When she emerged from the grove, the air seemed sharper, the night colder. The stars above were brighter now, their light spilling over the snow-covered ground. Zaelith glanced back once, her gaze lingering on the dark line of pines silhouetted against the sky. "Keep your song," she said quietly. "I'll carry it with me." With that, she turned and continued her journey, the path ahead winding into the shadowed expanse of the Faelyn Valley. Behind her, the whispering pines held their vigil, their voices a soft, eternal chorus in the heart of the winter forest. The forest thinned as Zaelith continued her journey, the tall, whispering pines giving way to open sky. She felt the shift before she saw it. A lightening of the air, a faint brightness pressing through the trees as if beckoning her forward. Her footsteps slowed, her senses attuned to the quiet transformation around her. The snow underfoot grew softer, its surface gleaming faintly with starlight. Then she stepped into the clearing. The space was wide and circular, its borders marked by a loose ring of frost-draped trees that bowed gently inward, as if paying homage to the vast sky above. The ground was a pristine blanket of snow, undisturbed and glistening like a field of powdered diamonds. Zaelith paused, her violet eyes lifting to the heavens. The stars were breathtaking. They hung low and luminous, as though the fabric of the night had been pulled taut, pressing the celestial lights closer to the earth. Constellations she had long known, and others she had never seen, stretched across the sky in an intricate dance. The snow reflected their brilliance, creating the illusion that the stars both hovered above and lay scattered across the ground. It was as if she stood at the center of the cosmos, balanced between the heavens and the earth. Zaelith took a step forward, her silver hair catching the starlight, her cloak flowing behind her like a ripple in the snow. She found herself drawn to the middle of the clearing, where the air felt stiller, heavier, yet not oppressive. It was a stillness that held her gently, like a lullaby that had no need of words. She lowered herself to sit on the snow, the cold seeping faintly through her clothing, but failing to discomfort her. Her breathing slowed as she gazed upward, her sharp features softening in the glow of the stars. She felt small but not insignificant, as though her place here, this night, this moment, was a necessary thread in the vast tapestry of the universe. It was not long before her thoughts wandered, as they often did on such tranquil nights. She remembered another clearing, another time when the stars had been her companions. She had been traveling with her companions then, an unlikely band of adventurers brought together by chance and held together by shared purpose. They had camped beneath the stars on the eve of a great storm, their fire flickering weakly against the encroaching cold. Zaelith had told stories that night, weaving words with the same effortless grace as she wielded her blade. Her companions had listened, rapt, their laughter ringing out against the night as she recounted her exploit, embellishing just enough to keep them entertained. It had been a rare moment of levity, a reminder that even amidst peril, there was room for joy. She smiled now, remembering the warmth of that night. Those companions were far away now, scattered by the winds of time, yet their voices still echoed faintly in her memory, as constant as the stars themselves. "I wonder if you see these same constellations," Zaelith murmured, her voice soft, "or if your skies have changed." Her gaze dropped to the snow in front of her, where the faint shadow of a nearby tree etched itself into the sparkling white. The snow here seemed to hold its own light, an ethereal glow that shifted with the stars above. She reached out a gloved hand, brushing the surface lightly with her fingertips. The snow was fine and cold, like powdered silk. She traced a small shape in it, a star, simple yet perfect, and then brushed it away, leaving the surface smooth once more. The clearing seemed alive in its own way, though it held no movement beyond the gentle flicker of starlight. The air was thick with the magic of the valley, its presence not heavy or overbearing but comforting, like the warmth of an old friend's embrace. Zaelith let herself relax into the stillness, her thoughts quieting as the clearing seemed to breathe around her. Somewhere nearby, a faint sound stirred her attention. The soft crunch of snow. She turned her head slowly, spotting a lone stag emerging from the shadow of the trees. Its fur was pale, nearly white, and its antlers stretched high above its head, tipped with frost that sparkled like jewels. The stag moved with deliberate grace, each step careful and measured. It paused at the edge of the clearing, its dark eyes meeting Zaelith's. For a long moment, they regarded each other. The stag's presence was calming, its gaze steady and knowing. Zaelith inclined her head slightly, a gesture of respect. The stag held her gaze a moment longer before dipping its head, its antlers catching the starlight in a dazzling display, and then turning back into the forest. The sound of its footsteps faded into the stillness, leaving Zaelith alone once more. She sighed softly, though it was not a sigh of sorrow. It was a sigh of peace, of contentment. The clearing had given her something rare, a moment outside of time, a reminder of the vastness of the world and her place within it. Rising slowly, Zaelith brushed the snow from her cloak and looked once more at the sky. The stars seemed to pulse faintly, their light a silent farewell as she prepared to leave. She took one last lingering glance at the clearing, at the untouched snow and the faint shadows of the trees, before turning back toward the path. As she stepped into the forest once more, the clearing receded behind her, its glow fading into the darkness, yet its peace lingered, a quiet warmth that settled in her chest and guided her steps forward. The forest stretched ahead, its mysteries still unfolding, but Zaelith carried the stars with her now, their light a steady beacon in her thoughts. Zaelith emerged from the last stretch of the Faelyn Valley's ancient forest, her boots crunching lightly on the snow-dappled path as the trees gave way to an open glade. There, nestled in a cozy hollow beneath a slope, stood Kharisethra-a's house. It was as charming as it was peculiar, a snow-covered cottage of weathered wood and crooked chimneys, with walls that seemed to lean ever so slightly, as if in conversation with one another. Lanterns hung from the eaves, their soft golden glow spilling into the frosty air, and the faint tendrils of smoke curling from the chimneys carried the scent of pine and spice. Zaelith paused, her violet eyes lingering on the scene before her. The journey had been long, but the sight of the warm light beckoning her forward filled her chest with quiet intent. She adjusted her silver-edged cloak and stepped toward the house, her movements slow and unhurried, as though savouring the moment. As she approached, the door creaked open before she could lift her hand to knock, and there stood Kharisethra-a. The little witch was a delightful contradiction, her hunched figure wrapped in layers of patchwork shawls that made her seem both fragile and unshakably solid. Her face, deeply lined with age, held an unmistakable twinkle of mischief in her eyes. A pair of spectacles perched precariously on the tip of her nose, magnifying her sharp, inquisitive gaze. "Zaelith, my dear girl," Kharisethra said, her voice warm and crackling like the fire that surely awaited inside. "You've kept me waiting, and in this cold no less." Zaelith laughed softly, brushing a stray strand of silver hair from her face. "I see the valley hasn't dulled your wit, Kharisethra." The witch waved a hand dismissively, ushering Zaelith inside with a flurry of motion that belied her age. Come. Standing out there like a frostbitten twig. Bob's been asking after you all evening." The mention of Bob made Zaelith smile as she ducked through the low doorway. The interior of the cottage was exactly as she remembered. Cluttered, cozy and alive with warmth. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with jars of herbs, bundles of dried flowers, and peculiar trinkets that seemed to hum faintly with enchantment. The air was rich with the mingling scents of cinnamon, pine resin, and something faintly metallic that Zaelith could never quite place. A hearth dominated one wall, its fire crackling merrily beneath an iron cauldron that emitted faint wisps of steam. Bob, Kharisethra-a's fluorescent chicken, was perched on a low stool near the fire, his plumage glowing faintly in hues of green and blue. He clucked in excitement as Zaelith entered, his bright eyes fixing on her with an intensity that always amused her. "Hello, Bob," Zaelith said, giving the bird a small bow. "Still keeping Kharisethra-a in line, I hope." Bob clucked again, as if affirming his important role in the household. Kharisethra shuffled toward the hearth, muttering under her breath, as she pulled a pair of mismatched teacups from a shelf. Sit, she ordered, gesturing to a chair draped with a quilt. "You look half frozen, and I won't have you turning into an icicle under my roof." Zaelith obeyed, settling into the chair with a sigh of relief. The warmth of the fire seeped into her bones, and she stretched her legs out, letting her boots thaw. Kharisethra handed her a steaming cup of tea, the liquid a deep amber that shimmered faintly in the firelight. Winter root and honey, Kharisethra said, her tone matter-of-fact as she settled into her own chair with a small grunt. Good for the cold. And for you with all that wandering about in the snow. Zaelith took a sip, the tea's earthy sweetness spreading warmth through her chest. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the coziness of the cottage envelop her. Outside, the wind stirred faintly against the windows, but it seemed a distant thing, unable to touch the sanctuary within. You've been busy, I see, Zaelith said, gesturing toward a shelf crowded with new additions. A set of glittering crystal vials, a carved wooden owl that blinked lazily as though alive, and a stack of peculiar maps covered in shifting runes. Kharisethra followed her gaze and chuckled. Oh, you know me. A little spell here, a little bargain there. The valley provides, as it always has. And what of you, my dear? Did the journey treat you kindly? Zaelith hesitated for a moment, then smiled. The valley is as magical as ever. I crossed a bridge of frost, listened to the pines whisper their secrets, and sat beneath a sky that seemed made of nothing but stars. It was peaceful. Kharisethra nodded, her wrinkled face softening. The valley has a way of knowing what you need, and you, Zaelith, always find the magic in it. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly as the shadows danced across the walls. Bob dozed on his stool, his faint glow pulsing rhythmically, like the gentle rise and fall of a sleeping breath. The stillness of the room was a balm, a quiet reminder of the beauty in simple moments. Eventually, Kharisethra leaned forward, her sharp eyes gleaming. I've saved something special for you. Zaelith raised an eyebrow as Kharisethra produced a small, intricately wrapped bundle from beneath her shawls. The witch set it on the table between them, untying the strings with careful fingers. Inside was a charm carved from a piece of pale wood and etched with delicate runes. It gleamed faintly in the firelight, its surface smooth as glass. For your travels, Kharisethra said, her voice unusually soft. The valley's blessing carried with you wherever you go. Zaelith picked up the charm, turning it over in her hands. It felt warm to the touch, as though it held a piece of the hearth's fire within it. She smiled, gratitude shining in her violet eyes. Thank you, Kharisethra. I'll treasure it. The witch waved a hand. Just don't lose it in some goblin-infested ruin. Now, finish your tea before it gets cold. Zaelith laughed, lifting the cup once more as the fire crackled on. Outside, the Faelyn Valley rested beneath the stars, the winter forest blanketed in quiet magic. Inside, the warmth of Kharisethra's hearth wrapped around them both, a sanctuary untouched by the passage of time. For tonight there were no adventures to chase, no treasures to seek, only the comfort of friendship and the glow of a fire against the cold. Thank you for wandering through the Faelyn Valley with me. Until next time, keep dreaming, keep wandering, and sleep well. Wanderers. This is Mooncat, signing off.